Right, so hello everyone. My name is Eric Wahlberg, and I want to thank you for grabbing the reins. Today we are talking to Ahmed al-Dakhil, who is the mind behind the self-hosted publication Post Apathy, and whose work can also be seen in publications like Althwort. Ahmed, thank you so much for joining me, man.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I think naturally the first place to start, Ahmed, is to talk about a little bit about yourself. You do talk a little bit about the why of post apathy on the website, but if you could just say it for the audience and a little bit about yourself in general.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm 23 and I'm based in the UK. My academic background is it involves a mix of things. So I studied a mix of business, politics, and law, although my
Hmm.
focus at the moment is sort of veering into investment and finance. Um, so my interests are pretty general. I like to compound interest, and that sort of feeds over into the themes and the content of Post Apathy. Um,
Hmm.
so Post Apathy really began as a newsletter collating the interesting articles that I had been reading in any
Hmm.
given month. One of my heartfelt ideas, I guess, is that most information is useless, hence the
Yeah.
tagline, cutting out the noise. And since I spend pretty much all day consuming information, I thought I'd gotten pretty good at cutting out the noise and identifying the signals. So I wanted to sort of share what I found useful with my friends as well as my small following at the time.
Hmm.
At first it was pretty crude operation, literally just throwing 20 to 30 links a month at people. Um,
Hmm.
no summaries, nothing like that. But after the first few months, you sort of get into the groove of things. I got a bit more experienced with it. And I began to make it more organized and adding summaries and syntheses, cutting down the number of links, and generally just trying to make my newsletter as value added to your time as possible. Um, the general themes of all of this, I'm trying to weave a golden thread at the intersection of technology and modernity, civilizational dynamics and history, um, looking at postmodern social theory,
Hmm.
and also something that I like to talk about a lot, which is imperial statecraft and urban
Yeah.
governance. I'm
Hmm.
a big proponent of what I call barbell governance, borrowing the term barbell from Nassim Taleb's book, um, Anti-Fragile. So that's sort of how post-apathy came about, um, and what the themes are. Although it's going under some reconstruction over the next month or so. So I think starting in January, actually, it's going to have a new direction, and I think people will find it very interesting. What I'll say is that it's focused on statecraft.
Wonderful. Well, that I'm certainly excited to hear that. And just from the title alone, post apathy and kind of what I've been. One of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk to you is because I can clearly see that we have a common interest in and we have we've I think we've evaluated the current moment in the same way, which is that people are very disillusioned with the current moment. There's a lot of learned helplessness that plagues, I think, the younger generations. And so, why don't you talk a little bit? What is and this is for those who want to check it out because it's now on the website for Athwart. But the piece that you did for Athwart titled "The Alliance Sacrée," and why do you think it would potentially be an optimal societal arrangement?
Yeah, so the essay I wrote in the thought was less of a proposal for an optimal societal arrangement and more of a desire to move the Abrahamic faiths towards constructive dialogue and, more importantly, action.
Hmm.
So, sort of historical context here is this: Muslims are newcomers to the West, unlike
Hmm.
Christians and Jews, obviously. And
Hmm.
so, when we're looking at political and economic and social issues in the West, we are often either ignored or treated with ambivalence, if not outright hostility.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening now is there is a generational divide occurring with the sort of anti-Muslim Fox News binging boomer demographic giving way to a more civilizationally minded younger millennial Zoomer population. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things I've found is that, particularly on the, quote unquote right, many are becoming extremely receptive to dialogue across the aisle and even
Mm-hmm.
further action around shared principles. I think really that what we've been witnessing over the past decade in terms of the accelerating authoritarian tendencies, especially when it comes to freedom of religion, freedom of practice, um, it's forced a reconsideration between the different Abrahamic faiths toward each other to see
Mm-hmm.
what we can share. Because the problem is quite simple, really. Groups like Jews, Muslims, and Catholics are all minorities.
Mm-hmm.
We are being constantly assailed by certain groups who want to curtail our practice and even to stop teaching our own children and passing on our beliefs to them. And so each of these faiths have largely attempted to fight this battle individually, but they're faring pretty miserably from what I can see.
Oh yeah.
And so really, a sacred alliance is an attempt to build a firm platform for the faiths to come together, to agree on a set of firm principles, which lead on to a set of policies to support, and then ideally to go on to work together through a variety of ways, be that on political, economic, or social issues, not just to push back against, the encroaching tyrannical approach to religion and religious freedom, but also to provide a proactive response to the widespread immiseration and malaise of Western society.
Mm-hmm.
So really the point is to take, what we call today interfaith, which is really just an excuse for expensive conferences and pictures and mocktails. Take it beyond this sort of lame boomer arrangement to engage in real dialogue, figure out what our principles are, and then combine that with action on the ground. So one of the things I did with my Afford essay is to go beyond theory. I'm not just talking about interfaith and theory. I do propose a set of institutions in
Right.
that essay.
And
One
there's
of those
historical context, right, for some of
yeah,
those as
absolutely.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, please.
So I develop it from theory through to history and then through to the modern day, and how we can bring all of that together to build institutions. So one of them is what I call a community wealth fund. Essentially, I've taken inspiration from the German public savings union called the Sparkassen Finanzgruppen. Um, and I'm looking at ways of how to make this a sort of non-interest institution to accomplish two things. One, to focus on a sort of equity-based finance model. Now, groups like Catholics, for instance, and Muslims have very strong positions against interest. So do Jews to a lesser extent, I think. Disclaimer, obviously, I'm not fully aware of the exact nuances on that. But to some degree, we all share these principles. So the goal here is to create a model of savings and investment banking that looks beyond consumption and interest and more towards equity and productive powers in the Listian sense. And
Yeah.
by that, I mean the German
Yeah.
American economist Friedrich List.
Yes.
So I'm sort of bringing in multiple themes here.
Yeah, please.
Another thing I want to also look at is the Sparkassen is decentralized, it's public, and it's non-profit. Now that doesn't mean they don't do well or that they're sort of the poor man's bank. They do very well. They've got customer service. I've interacted with them in Germany myself. But because each branch only banks with locals and only invests in local businesses, what happens is they have an intimate understanding of the community around them. And they then turn, decentralized areas into engines of economic growth because their mission is to help locals save and then also invest those savings into local businesses. which larger banks would never do. So it's about bringing access to capital to less well-off communities, communities who don't have access to these to capital, or who would never be lent to by these big banks. But also it's to try and weed out the sort of exposure to interest, which these days is all too often predatory and is involved in a significant amount of rent seeking. There's also an element of perhaps making non-interest loans accessible on an IOU basis. So the writer David Graeber, he wrote a book called 5,000 Years of Debt, I think. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
I
The
haven't,
general
no.
idea, yeah, so it's a great book actually. And if you've read another book called Neil Ferguson's The Ascent
Yes,
of
history.
Money, yeah.
Yeah.
So David Graeber sort of represents the other side of the argument. And so for Graeber, debt, non-monetary debt, plays a very important role in society. So this sort of also intersects with something I've written on Post Apathy called the commodification and technification of urban spaces and relations. So one of the concerns I've got is that the political economy in our part of the world has essentially commodified as much of our urban relations and spaces as possible. And so, the Graeberian IOU model, where people just owe each other one, has sort of been done away with. And that's a very dangerous thing, because what we've seen is that poor people not only lose the very important networks that give them access to capital and stuff like that, but then they also lose access to community and favors and debts in that sense. So they are completely trapped. So that's sort of the general philosophy behind that particular institution and how it ties back to the wider framework for cooperation.
Right. And the historical guidepost that you use in the piece is the Millet system from the Ottoman Empire, correct? And could you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the closest thing I can match this to is a sort of corporatist model as it existed in Europe in the medieval period. And essentially what this model was a very decentralized model of political organization, where every ethnic or religious group in the empire was organized into autonomous, largely self-regulating communities. And so what you had was this complex, multi-layered political system. At the top, you had, the imperial layer, obviously. And then in the middle, you had, local notables, wealthy merchants, religious leaders, nobles, etc., who would act as intermediaries between the communities on the local level and the imperial government machine on the federal level. And so in return for significant amount of cultural and legal autonomy, these communities were expected to do two things really. Pledge their allegiance to the dynasty and also, pay up a tax. But apart from that, each community largely was independent and organized their own institutions for themselves. So, for example, schools, hospitals, the things we take for granted today to be state-run and funded were in the pre-modern age largely funded and organized by each of these millets for their own people, I guess. And these were generally done through charitable endowments. A lot of those still exist today, by the way. These are, endowments that have been running for hundreds and hundreds of years. And actually, even today, there are legal battles and things like that running through Turkish courts, for instance, to settle disputes surrounding endowments and property ownership and things like that. So even after the dissolution of the empire and the widespread destruction and the rise of the nation state, these enduring elements of the different millets, which was their charitable endowments funding their religious institutions and hospitals and schools, they're still around, but obviously in a much more diminished form and with far less autonomy. But I think it speaks to the enduring power of those institutions, and perhaps to the possibility of sort of not necessarily bringing them back, but looking at upgraded forms of that for the 21st century. When we discuss, if society is collapsing, how can we rebuild it? And if you can't
Right.
do that through government, how are you going to do that on the ground level? And so the reason I went through this historical sort of investigation into the Millet system was to show to what degree people on the ground, private communities, can take control of things like healthcare and education and provide those to the community on their own terms, organized by themselves, if the state itself has become too incompetent and decrepit to do it itself.
You know what it really reminds me of is the counter, like it's basically a great parallel to, people talked about the British Empire and how they administered their empire. They administered that empire with very few, boots on the ground in the actual, places that they, lorded over, or part of their imperial, vestiges. But so they were really good at conserving their external imperial power. The Millet system seems like a really great way to basically conserve imperial power when dealing with a heterogeneous, domestic population.
I think, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And an obvious criticism and sort of disclaimer that you obviously need to put in front of these things is that these arrangements were not out of idealism; they were out
Right.
of necessity. So, as you mentioned, empires did not have the administrative and bureaucratic technologies to penetrate too deeply, hence this pragmatic arrangement. So, if we are to consider, building a sort of complex multi-layered society, we have to remember that an arrangement like this, with that sort of liberty, can't arise out of idealism, but out of a refashioning of the material reality that constitutes our political, economic, and socio-economic organization. And so that's sort of my pushback when people tend to get a bit too nostalgic about these things. Have you
Hmm.
read Seeing Like a State by James Scott?
No.
So it's a great book, and basically it really succinctly distills the sort of philosophy and driving force behind the modern state. And one of Scott's ideas is essentially that the modern state, strives for legibility. It wants to
Hmm.
organize everything, it wants to record everything, it wants to be able to organize and control everything. Um, and so this legibility, the strive for legibility, comes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, the development of two main things: communications technology, like the telegraph, for instance, the railway allowing faster travel times. So communications technology and transport infrastructure. For the first time, polities can penetrate in terms of enforcing their will, enforcing their laws, enforcing taxation from the federal level all the way down to the local level. And so the state, in this way, enforces legibility where everyone, for the first time, the subjects of any particular region can be recorded, they can be taxed, they can be conscripted for wars.
Hmm.
That sort of goes back to Charles Tilly's saying that something like war made the state and the state made war. So you've got multiple
Hmm.
themes here: legibility, war making, technological advancement. But essentially, these things undo the prior arrangement of milletism. And so, really, the question is today, with the rise of software technology, um, are we witnessing a new period of decentralization, which
Hmm.
makes something like milletism possible? And so, one of the things I raise in the athwart essay is fractal localism. And so, this idea
Yes.
of fractal localism, for instance, Nassim Taleb talks about it a lot. Um, and it's essentially a mathematical 21st century version of Milletism, or even Catholic subsidiarity, but both of which are largely similar. So that's sort of the themes I'm investigating at the moment. Is there a way to create a political arrangement which sees an advantage in complexity, in autonomy and sort of barbell model for governance? And what I mean by that is, instead of the homogenizing middle, which is the nation state, is there a possible model where you can have an imperial structure at the top and a sort of autonomous localist structure at the bottom, as opposed to homogenizing middle? And so that question really is in the air at the moment.
Yeah, and when I think about just like the current situation around coronavirus and the failures certainly in the Western world, by their nation state governments, I've been interested to see kind of the emergence of, and I would consider these almost green shoots to what you're talking about. But for example, the use of in the United States, even though eventually, a lot of the coronavirus treatments became kind of publicly, paid for, but people, using things like GoFundMe, for example, in lieu of, stimulus checks when, the second check didn't come and so on. So in terms of just decentralization, I could certainly see, platforms like GoFundMe being an example of that. But what I find interesting is those, you can donate, and many people choose to donate and anonymously. There isn't the same like identitarian framework that's organizing. There's no organizing principle around identity with something like a GoFundMe.
So what I'll say about that is,
yeah,
software is an ersatz replacement for community. And you're right, when you're looking at things like GoFundMe, it's attempting to fill the gap that society should be filling. Now, throughout the 19th and 20th century, the state took most, if not all, power from communities. And so the deal was, in exchange for that, the state would provide. And so the British really lead the way in regards to this with, establishing a modern publicly funded education system and then a healthcare system and so on and so forth. And so the idea was that the state would take care of these things. What we're seeing now in the 20th, 21st century with states, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is that contract, which was really enforced by the state itself. The state is now sort of reneging on that contract.
yes,
And as a result of that, what's happening is actually what you're seeing is a transition from a formerly high trust society here to an increasingly low trust society. You can't trust, you can't trust formal institutions to do their job anymore. You can't trust public health officials. You can't trust the hospitals. You can't trust the media. You can't trust the government. And it's not because, of any conspiracy. It's simply because they have failed completely at fulfilling their basic functions. What the coronavirus has done is exposed what has been going on for at least the past 3 or 4 decades, which is the hollowing out of vast swathes of public and civic institutions. The problem with that, of course, is that you don't realize that this hollowing out, this sort of parasitic hollowing out of the basis of these institutions has been going on until someone gives the chair a kick, and then you realize, the legs were mostly gone. And so that's what we're discovering now. Which
do you
means,
think? Oh, go ahead, please finish up.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to ask, because America, I mean, probably with the exception, basically, from 1946 maybe to like 1963 when Kennedy got assassinated, was probably, that was its period of being a high trust society. I mean, I think that the United States is kind of a low trust society to the nth degree. Whether it's whether it was John Kennedy saying what can you do for your government, or Reagan's view that government was the problem. Do you think that gives the United States an inherent advantage in, basically like accelerating the destruction of these non-functioning institutions and replacing it with something new?
I guess there are two things there immediately. One, I'd say when we're talking about low and high trust, that's more of a relative measure.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if you want to compare America to China,
Yes.
China is probably the society with the lowest amount of trust on earth, which is why it's the state and technology, um, which is filling the vacuum when it comes to what we would expect, civil norms, civil society, civil functions to fill. So I would say in relation to that, America remains a high trust society, but it's
Mm,
hemorrhaging and quite fast. Um, and the risk, of course, is that we see an expansion of things like the administrative state. We see an expansion of techno-surveillance society, and essentially what I call techno-sonicism, which is essentially Western states adopting, sort of East Asian, Chinese Communist Party um, governance techniques as a result of our own failures to do our jobs as governments. I think actually with the lockdowns when they first began around March, that was the first expression of institutional incompetence and lack
mm,
of institutional sovereignty in the West, because it simply copied what the Chinese were doing, which is just blanket lockdowns, no end in sight. No one
right.
knew what they were doing at the time. They still don't. We know that, here in the UK, for instance, you know, we don't know when this lockdown is going to end. The government said you're going to get a week off lockdown at Christmas, and then after that, you're going back in, and then it's going to continue until March next year. So, a full year of just complete and total institutional chaos and decay. And so that's risking a sort of vicious cycle where we become a lower trust society, which means more techno surveillance, more heavy handed state intervention, which leads to less trust, and so on and so forth. So those are sort of the trends that I'm witnessing now.
Okay, interesting. So I'm going to do what is kind of a hard pivot, but I mean, I think it's somewhat related, which would basically be, okay, so let's say that there's a lot of people, and I think understandably so, who've basically been looking for a way out of this system kind of in entirety, and the interest in charter cities have risen, tremendously certainly in the last, 7, 8 months, but obviously has been going on, for a long time. But, you know, one thing that I'm interested in, just from the example of this week, Amazon launched its, pharmacy, with expectations of reducing the prices of, generic drugs by 40% and some other drugs by, something like 60 to 80% over time. In the United States, obviously, we're known for not having, single payer healthcare. So basically, what you see, right, is Amazon taking action to lower the cost of drugs. Certainly, things like insulin, which is in a high obesity, country like the United States, is a non-trivial has a non-trivial impact on lower middle class balance sheets. And I guess one of the things that I'm interested in, also I think something approaching 1/3 of Americans have an Amazon Prime membership, and I'm sure that will increase certainly as it takes the place of as it continues to, make impacts on things like healthcare, which is one of the highest, expenditures for an American family. So I like this idea of, so corporate sponsored charter cities, and, your Amazon Prime membership, serving as a substitute for your social contract, because your social contract is, increasingly worth very little. What do you think about that?
I think one of the dangers of all of this is you're right. There is this sort of filling of the vacuum by the failure of public institutions. So you've got corporations like Amazon moving in to do things like going to pharmacy, not just pharmacy, but throughout the quarantine and the virus spreading. Amazon played a critical role in terms of its logistics
Hmm.
in getting food to people. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's essential needs in life that are now being provided by corporations. So obviously the question next is, as you mentioned, why don't they start building their own cities? If you're providing everything like a government, why don't you simply become the government? Um, I'm definitely not a fan of profit maximizing corporations like Amazon and other companies, be they tech or logistics or otherwise, moving into this space. And that's because their mission is to maximize profit. And so I talk about the commodification of urban spaces and relations in an essay on Post Apathy. And so really, Amazon is simply taking advantage of these long-term trends where society has been hollowed out, where public institutions have been hollowed out, and now everything is based on money, it's based on transactions, and that's not a great place to be. To me, it seems like we're entering the early stages of a sort of corporate feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it doesn't have to be that way. Corporations can serve another role. And so the origins of the corporation weren't as commercial institutions, by the way. They were
Right.
actually social and cultural bodies. And so in medieval Europe, you know, society was arranged along the corporatist model. And so society was essentially organized into various interests. So you had, interests around a particular craft, interests around a particular ethnic group, and so on and so forth. Um, and so this is where the origin of the corporation comes from. And so when I talk about corporation states and charter cities, it's in the context of this sort of throwback where maybe today we can again have corporations that are less focused on the profit maximization aspect, um, and more focused on sort of genuine civic building initiatives and the cultivation of the productive power of their city, again, in the Listian sense. As such, we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about corporations with normative values, like we see the woke corporations today,
Right.
they have normative values as well. However, unlike woke core, these corporations seek to build and not to destroy and cancel. So actually, if we go back in history, say between the 15th century and the 18th century, which was the heyday of the mega corporation, the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company. These weren't just profit maximizing corporations. The Hudson Bay Company was at one point the largest landowner on Earth, 15% of the world's surface. This was in Canada. And so they weren't just traders, they had to run cities, they had to establish and enforce laws, they had to provide security, and so on and so forth. Um, so the corporation was a different beast back then. Of course, as the corporation experiences success in its colonial endeavors, the state becomes more powerful, and then the state follows the corporation over the sea and absorbs the corporation. And so we see the decline of the corporation in this sort of space and its transformation into merely, this sort of profit maximizing commercial body. However, in the 21st century, the question then is, are these sort of mega corporations with these civic responsibilities, with the right and responsibility to enact and execute laws and govern over people's lives, is that going to make a comeback? If it is going to make a comeback, what form is it going to be? Can we influence that form for the better, or is it inevitable that we are witnessing the slide into a sort of corporate feudalism where the state is too weak to protect us against, predatory profit maximizers like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk? Even I think is going in this direction. So Elon Musk, he acts like a cute guy, memeing on Twitter all the time.
Yeah.
If you look at his plans from a political perspective, not just like a normie perspective, or even like a tech perspective, where these people, especially on the West Coast, they ignore all political considerations and they just focused on the shiny gadgets. If we look at it from a political perspective, Elon Musk wants to monopolize transportation and energy, and at some point he will want to leverage these into governing territory, essentially. That's what Mars is. I actually think his ideas around Mars are a sort of metaphor for
Mm,
Musk's society on Earth. Um,
very interesting.
you'll
That
see.
just to
It's
just
just, yeah.
just to say how that's interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Weinstein, but he says, he doesn't think that Elon Musk is serious about Mars, as serious as he proclaims to be. That there's some kind of like both, it's to kind of re-energize, people's obviously inspiration in doing hard big things, but that there's also another motive. And I know that Elon recently tweeted out about how basically nation state, he wouldn't expect the laws of any country on Earth to be the governing, like legal framework for people on Mars. Which, if you take what you're saying, which I find very interesting, it's as a metaphor. I can see how that extends, actually really just into, the legal framework that he would want to implement here on Earth.
Exactly. So, you can get away with talking about Mars and saying no Earth government can interfere with our plans for Mars. Now, the men in black suits in government, they're not going to blink twice at that. They're just going to say, whatever, this guy's just a crazy tech guy, right? But
Right.
imagine if Musk starts talking about, let's say a patch of territory in the States, for instance, saying, my Tesla factory is here, this is my territory, no government can enforce its sovereignty here. The United States government can't do anything about that. Things start to kick into gear really fast, and government won't be too pleased with that.
Right.
So in a way, one can see all his talk about Mars as a metaphor and a reflection for his plans here on Earth. And you're right about people needing these grand stories. They need mythologies which drive them forwards. I have no doubt that Musk at once believes in this mythology, but also knows that it is a mythology. In a way, it's sort of a split brain problem, I guess. But that's sort of just my own off the cuff theories about things.
No, it's, so I'll take, though, what I find, there's something that we have in the United States from a legal perspective that may be either a tool that you would appreciate, given that you would maybe want a little bit more alignment between the public, the government, and corporations, and it may actually be the tool of Elon Musk's undoing. But we've seen it used a lot in the United States in reaction to COVID. But we have something called the Defense Production Act. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I think I read a few articles on that earlier this year. Trump invoked it or something.
Yes, he invoked it with people like GM. This was all when there was a blitz to create ventilators. But it's actually something that's basically existed, I think, since World War II, and it allows executive power to reorient manufacturing towards some public end. So I'd wonder if it's the first time it's been used, obviously, since the last kind of great crisis that the country has been through, and I find it interesting. I wonder if in similar ways, we're still living with the Patriot Act in the United States and certain things from 9/11, and I wonder if perhaps, and I know that there's a bipartisan support now for various regulatory efforts against big tech, and so I wonder, that's obviously mostly focused just purely in the digital sphere, but we've now kind of maybe got some muscle memory or reinvigorated some muscle memory around using these other legal avenues for actually things around manufacturing. So I wonder if that might be a tool to actually achieve the alignment that I think you would probably seem like you would prefer, and maybe serve as an impediment for somebody like a Musk to kind of play out their plans.
So I think that's an interesting point. There is a possibility for a really focused president and administration to use the tools that are lying around. So there's, you've got the Patriot Act, you've got the Defense Production Act, you've got examples, I think, in World War II, actually, FDR. No, I think this was actually in the Great Depression, where the American government basically made private ownership of gold illegal, and they seized all the gold, right? So these tools, they still exist. They're just lying around. So there's a possibility that a really focused administration sees what's going on in regards to the collapse of American political economy, the collapse of 20th century ideas around, the dichotomy between capitalism and socialism, which really doesn't exist anymore. And for a really focused government to say, okay, look, we've got this crisis, state consciousness no longer exists, private industry is running amok, in many cases openly um, resisting, the demands of the government, even in favor of enemies like China. So, Elon Musk
Right.
was infamously doing this all year long. Um, and so I think, there's a really great essay in Palladium magazine written by David Villarreal called The Cybernetic Economy or something like
Oh,
that.
it was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote about it in one of my, I think it was the September newsletter, but essentially, technology and its ability to harvest cosmic amounts of data is playing a crucial transition role in the transition to a new economic model, which is a combination, a hybridation of state, technology, and these corporate entities really that are first and foremost logistics companies enabled by tech. So Amazon, for instance, isn't really a tech company, it's a logistics company.
Right.
I would go so far as to say that Elon Musk as well, his true genius doesn't really rely on technology. It relies firstly logistics and superior accounting. That's why he can
Yeah.
he,
Yes.
he can produce tech at such a cheap rate compared to say NASA. I mean, look at the disparity between what Musk is spending on rockets compared to what NASA spends on rockets.
Right.
Look at how he's pioneering the transition to the electric vehicle economy. Again, it's superior logistical systems, superior accounting systems. That's where his genius lies. The question then is, can a focused government essentially say, you know what, we've got these tools lying around, let's absorb Tesla, let's absorb Starlink, let's absorb Amazon Web Services, and over time integrate these things into the infrastructure of government. And so this leads on to another thing actually. So Bruno Machias, the Portuguese uh, ex-minister, he wrote about American virtualism,
Mhm.
and he wrote about something very interesting recently called, it was an essay called The Crypto State.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it was really difficult to follow, but the essence of it was really interesting to me because what he suggests is that the debate isn't whether it's going to be decentralized tech triumphing or the state triumphing over decentralized tech. Actually, both of these are going to be sidelined. The traditional state and decentralized tech are going to be sidelined by a new centralizing political force which uses this sort of technology to triumph over everyone else. So here's my question. Can there be an American government, an administration that has this sort of ethos where it says, we've got all this great technology lying around. Let's upgrade our legal and regulatory system and then use that system to integrate this tech and create a superior political form, which is just technologically superior to every other government, including and especially the Chinese. And I think
Right.
really, in this new Cold War that we're in, if America wants to overcome China, it needs to overcome, its century-old technical debt that is in its political, economic, regulatory, and social systems, and really upgrade itself as a government, as a futurist state, as I call it, in an essay
Yes.
I wrote called Chronopolitics.
Yes.
Um, and to become that futurist state, essentially, focused American government with state consciousness, absorbing these technologies and using it to become a superior logistical bureaucratic entity, and then overcoming the competition like China, which is giving America at the moment a hard run for its money at doing this. The Chinese are very good at this at the moment, um, and the Americans are lagging behind. Can that
Mm.
change? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I can say I think the landscape that would be permitting of that focus, especially given the demographics of the electorate, of the recent presidential election, and the Republicans picking up a much more diverse electorate, despite record level turnouts, which was always kind of expected to be like a huge boon for the Democrats alone. I basically, I don't see that the Republican Party, moving forward could become that majoritarian party. I do think that the Democrats could, but they would need to excise the progressive, the very harsh progressive arm of its party and absorb a little bit more of the, neocon, whatever's left over, like the neocons and whether they
Neoliberal.
would. Yeah. I mean, the neoliberal arm, but I think, Biden is a neoliberal, kind of more or less at
Yeah,
the
I
end
mean,
of
I
the day.
think that's what's happening now, isn't it, with Biden's administration? I mean, he's basically just pushed most of the woke people to the side, and his administration is like a superstar team of like the traditional Clintonite or Bush era neocons and neoliberals, from what I can see. So
The
maybe,
Yeah.
but
The one thing is I can't imagine how those are the group of people that would, because the level of self-reflection required to for those
I don't
people
think they
to,
will.
yeah,
I don't think they are the people. I think the people required for this don't exactly exist yet.
mm.
And I think what Americans need to do this decade is find those people and then
I
get those
think
people organized.
What do you think about Andrew Yang? I'm just curious because, for example, and actually I was just getting this up because it's kind of an extension of, it's kind of a new view of, or something a little bit more coherent or holistic with respect to the Defense Production Act. But in Andrew Yang's, 2020 run, one of the things that he suggested was something called an infrastructure force he called the Legion of Builders and Destroyers. So his suggestion was basically to repurpose 10% of the military budget, which is about 60 billion, $70 billion, to task these people to rebuild roads, power grids, levees, dams, and infrastructure. But what really is important that basically the Legion would prioritize projects based on national security and economic impact. And the command, he basically creates this fictitious but proposed title of Commander of the Legion, who would have the ability to overrule local regulations and ordinances to ensure that these projects are started and completed promptly and effectively. That seems to me like the type of thinking and the type of person that would be able to execute and implement, the reforms and the suggestions you're talking about.
I think that particular idea is absolutely necessary actually, and I like the fact that he was willing to go out and say we've got to override, local property interests and ordinances to get things done because this sort of regulatory bloat is one of the parts of the technical debt holding back the upgrading of American infrastructure. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, it's like, is Andrew Yang the person? I
Right. They
don't
can't.
think so. I don't think he has the temperament for it. And also, he's got these other weird ideas like UBI. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are talking about UBI. But what is UBI? UBI is just serfdom, it's feudalism. It's taking the power of the people to engage in the means of production or even own the means of production, and basically saying, what, here's a monthly government dole in return for that.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's my worry with people like Yang. But I think that idea of a legion of builders of destroyers is an amazing idea. It's absolutely necessary. But you need someone with a temperament and the will and a vision greater than Yang's to take that idea, that policy, and implement it for themselves.
Great. And I'm going to use this to, to transition to one of your other ideas, one of your other articles on Post Apathy. So you have a proposal for Thelian jurists, and you were very much inspired by the Federalist Society here in the United States. And I, what I find interesting about this also is, I recently read a comparison between basically China and the United States, and they spoke very, with a lot of they were yearning and they with admiration at the engineering and scientific background of the Chinese leadership, and basically critiquing, the United States as basically government being, made up of a bunch of lawyers. And I think it's interesting because for one, like if I could speak for myself, I do not. I think if anything, the Rooseveltian, administrative state has shown that you can't engineer away you can't engineer away or into submission the human condition. That's just not something that I really believe, in the medium or long term sustainable. But I do think you can create very effective legal frameworks that sets boundaries and constrains the human condition, and also kind of make sure that it's being utilized, both virtues and vices, in a productive way. So one, if you could talk about the Thelian Juris article, and also just be curious if you kind of agree with my assessment that actually the use of lawyers and the law in the United States is an advantage, especially when you talk about reducing the technical debt that you've described previously. That you can effectively do that through legal channels.
Yeah, so as far as I'm concerned, that's sort of a false dichotomy between, sort of having a leadership made of STEM people and then a leadership made of lawmen, essentially. The problem isn't that you lack STEM leaders. The problem is that you lack leaders at all. You simply don't have statesmen. And anyway, engineers tend to be very bad at designing societies anyway.
Right.
And even when it comes to China, China is a nation of laws in a very autistic sense. It brutally enforces formal law as a result of the fact that, vast swathes of social norms and customs were destroyed in China in the Cultural Revolution. And what filled the void was this top-down legislation and, this really bloated CCP machine that operates at every level of society. And as I discussed in my Post Apathy piece on commodification and technification, the technification of social relations through the use of surveillance technologies and, app-based social ranking systems. These are ways to enforce good behavior and social cohesion to fill that void left behind by the destruction of society. So I think it's less of a STEM versus humanities problem, more than the fact that China has an organized elite and America doesn't. America has statesmen who see themselves as statesmen. That's why they're there. That's what their job is. They embrace it explicitly. But in America, you don't have statesmen. You've got people who don't. I mean, look at Obama. What the hell is he doing? He's writing autobiographies as if he was never the leader. Oh, America needs to band together to get this. You were the president for 8 years, okay, and yet he's talking like he's on Oprah or something, like he's a commentator. When he was at the seat of power, American leaders do not see themselves as statesmen. America does not have state consciousness. China does. China has a party state consciousness. It has goals. It has a vision. They meet every 5 years to figure out that vision. So that's the issue here. It's not about STEM versus law. And anyway, I think even Xi Jinping, wasn't he a PhD in law or something?
I know that he was in agriculture because he was in Iowa for the early part of his career.
Yeah, I think he did agriculture first, and then maybe he went on to do So he did actually get a doctorate in law. So he's a mix of both. So that's really the issue here, and this is why I make that call, I guess, for sort of Thelian jurists who are essentially heroic jurist statesmen, people who recognize that you need a sort of cult of state, you need a state consciousness, you need a recognition that you are in public service, this is your position, this is your role, you need to execute on it. So I completely agree with you that having a legal framework, having a robust legal framework, having a civil society, things like that are very important. And having this sort of like autistic STEM leadership, that's never really happened before. Even in China, you don't have that too much. And people, they just tend to fantasize over credentials far too much. There is this sort of hype around STEM at the moment. And I'd argue that's less to do with realities of intelligence or even power, and more to do with the insecurities of a generation who may have been big on things like law and finance, but now because those industries are really saturated, and a lot of the money to be made and a lot of the expansion happening and a lot of the innovation happening is now in the tech sector. These people are giving tech all these accolades
Mm,
as an expression of their own insecurities around it. They were lawyers, but now you've got boomer lawyers telling their kids to go into tech because the opportunities are there. And
right.
there's this sort of generational anxiety there that sort of feeds into this fetish for STEM leadership.
That's fascinating. I mean, I I also wonder, if you could talk it in the context of, the West Coast century, which is actually the first post that I read of yours. Um, you know, basically, you are very critical of what you think is basically a missed opportunity. Whether you think that that's going to continue, but by the West Coast, who I mean, have basically in the last 20 years experienced probably the largest wealth creation event in human history. There's enormous amounts of, I mean, four, I think, out of five, or all of the trillion-dollar market cap companies in the United States are based on the West Coast. Yet they seem to be very unwilling or disinterested in defining what power would look like for them. I mean, and then obviously maybe this is with the without considering Elon Musk. I mean, maybe you would think that Jeff Bezos, who I think is probably a live actor in the power sphere as well, just because of his purchasings of major news publications, but that they seem unwilling, unable, and disinterested, in acquiring power. I know that if you're thinking about the technical debt, I'm sure that that's kind of tied to what's called the paper belt. Here in the New York City to Boston megalopolis, or Washington D.C. to Boston megalopolis. So I guess I want to begin to kind of tease out from you, what do you see? What are the green shoots, and do you see a synthesis of some of the strengths of the United States into something that could, take up the mantle, and put the United States and maybe the West at large on firmer footing, towards further progress?
Yeah, so I mean, this sort of ties back to a few things that we've talked about over the past hour or so. One of them is feudalism, and the other is state consciousness. So on the topic of feudalism, sorry, tech companies are like Norman conquerors in England or Sicily, or Spanish conquistadors in Latin America. They transplant themselves into communities like Seattle, San Francisco. They don't really care much for the locals outside their palaces and walls. They don't care for the politics. One, because of moral purity, they think they're above it. They think they're above these dirty, you know neurotypical games of human nature and politics.
Mm-hmm.
You get this sort of like Zuckerberg ideology towards politics, where tech believes they're above these things and that they can just solve everything with with a sort of techno salvationist approach to pretty much everything. And I call that autistification.
Right.
So that's one perspective to take on why this opportunity has not been grasped yet. I think, as you mentioned, actually, Jeff is definitely a live player. He didn't stay in the West Coast. He went to DC and he bought a house there, and now he's like a socialite there. So he's playing the power game very well. But Amazon is less a West Coast thing, and it's more of a general American and then Western company.
Right.
Another issue, of course, is that the West Coast is already the power center of America. It's not conscious of that yet. The East Coast maintains this sort of lagging legacy influence as being the power center of America. And that's something that the West Coast hasn't been really secure about, in terms of confronting that and saying, actually, California is not only the center of tech, now it's the center of finance. Okay, not New York. It's the center of agriculture, not the Midwest or Texas or whatever. And so California in itself is the power center already. The question is, where is the organized consciousness and desire to enforce that at a formal level? And to be honest with you, in sort of private conversations with people on the West Coast, they are afraid of playing power games with people on the East Coast. I think there is a sense of inferiority in this regard. Maybe they're right, because people on the East Coast, they know how to play these games very well. I mean, look at all the woke stuff, for instance.
Yep.
That's just the East Coast, the old WASP establishment taking back control just when it was slipping away from them. They're
Right.
very good at this. They're very good at this. And the West Coast is insecure about that. And it doesn't feel like it can contend with the East Coast, hence the sort of absorption of the West Coast into the paper belt. So, you see with the elections, Facebook and Twitter just essentially, this was a media coup. There's no way to call it
Right.
anything but that. It was just complete and total censorship of one side. And that was a sort of pledge of allegiance and fealty to the East Coast power center by, the tech companies on the West Coast saying, look, we're not a threat. We can play ball with you guys. So that's sort of a mismatch between having that material power, but not having the narrative power, not having the consciousness of that power. And even if you do have that consciousness that you do have it, you're not willing to essentially get into the arena and say, you've got to hand over the reins, you've been running this into the ground, we need to take control and we need to revive things. And really, this is no longer the world of the Atlantic, it's the world of the Pacific. The new world economy is now in Asia, between, the port of Los Angeles and the port of Shanghai. That's where most of the world's trade is happening now. That's a reversion to the norm of history, by the way. The sort of blip in history where it was Europe that was the center of trade. That's permanently gone now. And so a lot of the East Coast position and prestige in being on the Atlantic, that's going to dissipate with that sort of sea-based trade and world order. And it will eventually transition, perhaps, if people develop that consciousness, it could transition to the West Coast. And maybe one of the ways we could track that, actually, we could quantify it, is the degree to which West Coast actors and organizations and institutions become deeply interested in the political ramifications of the Pacific century. How involved are cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, and San Francisco in shaping trade deals with Pacific countries, in determining the power structure of the Pacific, and so on and so forth.
And so then I guess you would push back against these. I know Benjali talks about this. I know you follow, who I think is just a fantastic thinker all around. But basically he's very he's not shy about this. Very critical of, for example, the local government in San Francisco. Other people have been critical of other West Coast cities, governments. The governor Gavin Newsom of California recently got himself into big deep trouble. Basically this idea that that power base, that West Coast power base, he says will basically decentralize from there, and really it'll just kind of enter the cloud. And I can say from my personal network that I know a lot of people who have left. Now they haven't necessarily totally left kind of the west of the United States. A lot of them have found themselves in places like Park City, Utah, Salt Lake City, or Colorado. Some people have actually moved to places like New Hampshire, which just happens to have natural resource, natural setting, and also low taxes, which is kind of a novelty in the East Coast. So what do you think about that, though? I mean, so you're not really sold. Do you think kind of just the natural pull of history towards the Pacific will bring people back towards there over time?
One of the things I see when I look in history is you have, these obvious cycles of rise and decline. And so the question is, when you're in a period of decline, is this a permanent decline or is this a temporary decline leading to renaissance? And so when I look at the situation at the moment, obviously I'm not over there, so I'm not an expert or anything. But looking at the way that power continues to transition westward, it seems to me that although there's a lot of noise, a lot of voices around abandoning the West Coast, that's not correlating with the gravity of power and wealth that continues to move westward across the plains. And maybe that's just my misreading of things, but I think
No,
it's that, yeah. So what do you think? What do you think about that?
yeah, it's interesting. It's something that I've been trying to think a lot about. I think, I'm a New Yorker through and through, born and bred. I haven't really lived in other parts of the United States, so I'll have to admit a certain level of bias. I mean, I think that there are cultures and things about, for example, New York City, which makes it very robust in terms of being able to regenerate itself. Now we've had really fantastic, I mean, I would argue that that wouldn't have been the case, for example, post financial crisis, if Michael Bloomberg wasn't the mayor, because Michael Bloomberg, basically reoriented a large swath of the economy towards tech, um, created enormous trade relationships, specifically with the country of Israel, because of his, just connections there. That also created an enormous flow of human capital that wouldn't have left. There wouldn't have been the same. People wouldn't have moved from Boston, maybe, or San Francisco or Seattle to New York, but there were no shortage of Israelis or Indians that were willing to kind of move to New York. So that showed an enormous amount of robustness just here in New York City. With respect to the West Coast, I don't know how much the politics will transfer from the federal to the state level, but if Joe Biden has one success, which is to effectively suppress the progressive left, and if he governs at all well enough to kind of make people disenchanted, perhaps the rejection at the local level of city governance in places like San Francisco and Seattle would follow suit. Um, I don't see people who are highly skilled, just because of also like what wokeism is, what it really, what the tenets are, and how aggressive it is towards any kind of sense of excellence, and and the use of guilt against success for all people. I just don't see people wanting to live in those in the cities where the governments have really internalized that ideology. For example, I think probably the biggest geographic winner of this entire thing has been the state of Texas, which has absorbed the cities of Austin, which were already, forming tech centers. I think is in a really, really enormous, winner. And I think one of the interesting things is, yes, certainly power centers, and the new economies in Asia, but the United States only exports and imports like 14% of its GDP, half of which is contained in NATO, and an enormous amount of the manufacturing base is in Mexico now. So there is an interesting potential. There's a lot of hard skills. There's people in the space industry, as well as obviously oil and gas, which could be repurposed towards other things like advanced manufacturing, that maybe would find Texas also being a rising power within the contents of the United States.
I think I think this is one of the main reasons actually that I'm hashtag long USA.
Yeah,
Yeah, America's it's an extraordinary country for many reasons, and one of those reasons is simply it's an obscene country because it's endless money and people and natural resources and land and no enemies at the border, and it's just churning and churning and churning, and there's
right.
no proper center of economic power. You've got multiple centers. You've got the West Coast, you've got Texas, you've got New York and Boston, and so on and so forth. And so what this means is that even if one of those centers declines, its massive internal market of goods, people, and capital mean that they as you mentioned, they can just migrate to another part of the empire, set up shop there really fast, and continue business like no or minimal interruption.
Right.
Um, so I think that's why, even though there's a lot of issues now, especially with government and things like that and security, um, the fundamentals are so strong there's so much going on there that all you need to do is have a competent, conscious, sort of state capacity libertarian movement put themselves in the right places to just nudge things back into the right direction. And then you compare that with, say, China, for instance, and country like China, it's only held together via the most totalitarian government construct in possibly the history of humanity. What
Right.
else? How else can you describe the Communist Party in China? If it loosens its grip even a little bit, things could begin to spiral out of control.
Mhm.
And actually, Dr. Tyler Cowen, he
Oh,
made
love them.
yeah, so he did something today. He pissed a lot of people off, but he made a point about the fact that 250,000 Americans have died from COVID, and
Right.
yet America is just chugging onwards. Um,
Yes.
a lot of people got annoyed at him, but I think that's a very important point. You deal with the scale of incompetence and that sort of death and catastrophe, and your country hasn't collapsed yet. It just keeps going like
Yeah.
nothing. But that would have
I
collapsed any other country, like a house of cards.
Yeah,
You know,
I have to say, I spent a period of time in Israel, and it's a country filled with military veterans. So I mean, they're just hard people. They're just there's nothing soft about them. They're and like it's an enormous contrast, with what I was experiencing. What I felt like my view of Western people, generally speaking, were. So like when I moved back to the United States here in New York. I was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which I'm sure maybe you've heard of it. It's kind of like a mini Berlin, if you will. It's kind of where the birthplace of hipsters and so on, and it's a bunch of upper middle class people who went to the top 100 schools. And I always like to joke that they go to museums to take pictures on Instagram for the geolocation tag, and they don't really actually look at the art. Um, and I looked at those people and I thought, those people they're very soft. I'd be very worried in a World War II crisis, and this is back in 2017 before any of this happened. I was just very worried about the United States and its populous ability to absorb shocks, because they seem so overly sensitive, even during the good times, right? That was like one of the big worries, right before COVID was like, this is, how people are reacting, in the best of times. I mean, certainly the worst of times will come, and what will be their reaction. And so it's been an enormous shock. But I will say that I do think this is where I'll invoke Bruno again. His view of American virtualism is so interesting. Is I don't think it's the same thing as living in a geographic pressure cooker, for example, like Israel. I don't. It's not coming from any sense of like individual personal like robustness or self-sacrifice. It's really just an illusion or falling into narratives that you're using to distract yourself. So it's not coming from the same place, as which is interesting, though it may have the same effect.
so my question then is, which is better in the long term, and which is going to prove the long-term survival of the people then? And I think this idea of virtualism and what is essentially just a technologically advanced um, opium to lull the masses, like it's like a druggie, they will go through all sorts of things like diseases and physical injuries and so on and so forth, but they're just focused on the hit. And for that, they can go through anything. And so when you're looking at Americans today, it's sort of like their minds have been numbed so much. You could, they could be physically just mangled by something and they would barely notice. They just keep moving onwards. So there's this sort of an insane level of psychological engineering and even just like this titanic assault on the American mind to create um, this level of illusion, and it really makes me feel odd and weirded out, and it makes me wonder to what extent this is just an American thing or whether
Mm,
this is a technological thing that will eventually spread to other countries like some sort of viral disease.
right. It's interesting. I also lived, for example, in countries like I lived in South Korea, and I find that advanced East Asia, like South Korea and Japan, they also, when I first went there, I mean, I was really shocked by their relationship to technology. I mean, they really seemed to, they lived a lot of their, like, it wouldn't be, we're all experiencing this now during COVID, but they were just, this was what, 2015 or something like that. And they just lived an enormous part of their life in the digital sphere. And if you looked at, their fertility rates and basically, the age at which the average person, was having their first sexual encounter, there was a whole number of things that were like aligning, and I thought were like highly correlated to the fact that they were basically had they were disillusioned and weren't getting a lot out of their their physical reality, and so they've really kind of had dove headfirst into the virtual space, and it was having real impacts on the physical world. The one thing that I find there's a couple of people like, for example, an amazing follow on Twitter is a guy named Aaron Lewis, and he has this great piece called "The Garden of Forking Memes," where he talks a lot about basically how we've the digital sphere has kind of taken the individual out of any sense of time, like. And when you move throughout the digital sphere, you're kind of in a time machine. You could go and listen to Bach. You could go, read about something that happened in Roman history. You could read about what, Kanye West did today. And then you could read about a bunch of people, pontificating on what the prospects of the future are. And so what his suggestion at the end of the piece is to, since basically the most important thing going on right now is interfaces, right? Because that's how we're interfacing between, that's the doorway between the physical and digital reality. And he kind of suggests, how can we bring more of the real world into the interfaces that we experience, so that like we understand, right? Like, do you understand, right? Does the average person understand that there's a network of undersea cables that make up, and data centers that make up the the internet, right? And that those are really important things that you need to understand, and a lot of your life are dependent on. How could you basically bring that kind of awareness into the interface that you experience? I see that as basically being a way that you could prevent people from really just completely losing touch with reality, and such that eventually there will come a time, right, where something happens. Balaji in his recent podcast with Bruno talked about an electromagnetic cosmic event happening and just knocking off knocking down all the physical digital infrastructure, and what would people do? So yeah, basically bringing the real world into interfaces more. Whether if you think about the difference between light and dark mode, like, does that actually track with the outside of your window, right? And like, so bringing the real world into the interface, for example, that way, as being a kind of an interesting example.
So I think that's an interesting point, but when I think about the problem of interfaces and the sort of blurring of reality and digital, the answer seems quite obvious to me, and it's a bit of an Amish answer, but to me the answer is that if you're using digital, we need Urbit style interfacing.
Right.
Very plain, basic, minimalist, functional software. A lot of the software today is not innovative. It's just decades old software, decades old program. But they're creating ever fancier graphics designs and interface models to get you addicted to these things, right? So alongside Urbit style interfaces, and for the audience, Urbit,
yeah, please, I was going to ask you. Yeah.
So Urbit, I'm not an expert on it, and I find it quite difficult to use myself, but I really like the concept.
Yeah.
It's an operating system, so let's say like Windows or whatever, but it's the philosophy behind it is that it's very minimal. It takes out all the distractions, the colors and the fancy designs and so on and so forth, and it gives you the basic functionality of programs. And obviously, a large part of it is security, which is why a lot of people use it. It's very big on security. So basically, the general idea here is very minimalist interface for your technology. So you're not getting addicted to the fancy colors and the movements and so on and so forth. Secondly, it's a return really to analog for most things. There's a really interesting Twitter thread a few days ago from someone who worked in industry before the introduction of computers and software. And he actually made the argument that the introduction of software made processes far slower,
Oh, this
distracted
was the
people more.
accountant, right? He was talking about
Yeah,
accounting. Yeah,
yeah,
keep going.
yeah, that's it. So what he noticed was that software didn't actually encourage efficiency. It made things worse in terms of efficiency. And actually using analog, so pen and paper to record notes instead of a computer, was far faster than inputting these things on a computer. And
Right.
so what I think is that this is probably true for far more things that we are comfortable admitting, and that our experiment with attempting to basically compress all our tasks onto software on computers has been a massive drag on productivity, and we need to start pulling back. So that's the second thing. Third thing I think is there is a problem with the American perspective in general. And the reason this matters is because Americans are producing most of our technology, most of our
Right.
software. And so this American perspective is that you struggle to say no. You don't know how to say no like a parent tells their child, saying, you can't do this, right? And so what Americans do is instead of saying no, they find excuses around problems. And so, you mentioned Aaron Lewis's essay. Actually, I read that a while ago. Actually, it's really interesting. But I don't think that's a solution. I think the solution is very simple. It's that you've got to say no and enforce discipline, which means not using anything to do with software for more than half an hour to an hour a day, and then enforcing things like social penalties, for instance, or strong cultural and social traditions, such as tech Sabbaths, for instance, like days where people don't use tech, right?
Right.
And this
Right.
has to be a conscious thing promoted by government, industry, civil institutions, religions, and so on and so forth. Essentially to develop an Amish-style civilizational response to the negative effects of software technology, which is now, it's just completely run away, right? With the introduction of the iPhone in 2009, we've seen depression skyrocket among the youth, for instance.
Right.
And no one's doing anything. No one's saying no. We've just given phones to all the kids, and I've not met one parent with discipline to say to their 12-year-old kid, no, you don't get a phone. They can't say that because everyone else has a phone, right? It's peer
Right.
pressure. So we need to start reversing that equation. So to summarize, one, extremely minimalistic software interfaces. Two, return to analog for everything that doesn't need software. And then three, enforcing social penalties and strong traditions around the use of software technology.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that, and I think it's a lot of it. It has to just do with the history of the country, and just there was always more. There was always another frontier. There was always, very little about the history of the country told you no, right? And I think that percolated through the culture, and child rearing and so on. But
I mean, I don't, I don't,
go
I don't
ahead.
think that's necessarily true. I think this is actually specifically a consequence of the boomer generation and the way they were raised and the sort of things that trickle down with them. I mean, if you look at the Great War generation and the generation before them, it was all about discipline and self-sacrifice, and actually contrary to the post-boomer narrative of American individualism, American society was strongly based around these sort of collectivist identities and understandings of your duties and who you were supposed to sort of give up your time and your effort for, and even, if necessarily, your life for. In America, you conscript people to send them off to World War One and World War Two, and even Korea afterwards. But
Right.
then that starts to break down with Vietnam. Vietnam is where the dams break, and I wonder to what extent the dams broke because of that sort of rising boomer generation, which no longer wanted to commit to any sort of sacrifice and wanted to
Hmm.
promote this cult of the individual and to never be
Hmm.
told no to their personal desires, right? Um,
Right.
so I
I
guess one of
think,
the issues here is
yeah,
soulcraft.
go ahead.
So one of the issues here, I think, is soulcraft, which is a lost tradition, which is the disciplining of one's personal desires and one's um, innate human desire to just have as much, pleasure as possible. Um, and that's something that arose with the boomer generation. And so I guess one of the things that our generation needs to rediscover is the disciplining of the self and our willingness to do that because we recognize that in the short term it may be satisfying, but in the long term we lose out on a lot for ourselves, but also society loses out. And really, if you want a society, there's a point where you have to discipline yourself, give things up for the greater good. That's sort of a side tangent moving away from software, but I think it's slightly relevant there as a wider social cultural trend that has compounded the problems that we see today.
No, and okay, you really set me up for what I think a really great, what I think is interesting is, we've lived, our experience with the digital world has been through, these screens that basically require you to be static. So you're just kind of only engrossed in the virtual world, but an ever increasing number of things you can do in that virtual world. But I also wonder, things that teach you the lessons of, self-regulation and limitations is the fact that, the physical world, like you are limited, you are limited by the laws of physics and a variety of other, your the temperature outside and a whole number of things. So I also wonder if there's a hardware, not solution, but something that could be part of something that would enable this change. I talked recently with somebody, a gentleman named Josh Morin, and he was, talking about this really awesome piece in a publication called Emergence Magazine, and we talked about, if I asked him, or talked about, the use of the emergence of something like augmented reality, a la, Apple or Samsung, let's call them AR glasses. And the fact that what that would enable is, that you would free up your hands, and people would rediscover, their hands and using their hands in the physical world, and all the things that come along with that. One of the things that I think would be interesting is you add to that what you're suggesting with like an Urbit style kind of very minimalist interface, and you have something that's a lot more. I think you start to have a marrying of the worlds of atoms and the world of bits that's a lot more sustainable. That has incentives and allows for things that would enable that kind of what do you call it, uh,
Soulcraft.
soulcraft, that I think would be an interesting thing. And so I almost wonder if this period of 2000, I think 7, when the iPhone was introduced to, whenever they released these AR glasses, I wonder if we'll look back, with kind of horror, at what that incentivized and what that allowed for, and maybe the solution isn't just software but also a hardware.
So I think it's entirely possible and probably preferable to our current situation that we do achieve this seamless integration between software and reality through the form of hardware gadgets that enable us to use tech on the go. And I think actually I'd extend what you've said about, the period from 2007 onwards. I'd extend that right back to the development of the desktop computer, where for the first time you
Mm.
just had loads of people at a computer 8 hours or more a day. That entire 30, 40, even 50-year period up to today will be looked on in horror by future generations, not just because of what it's done to our minds, but also, the things we willingly subjected our bodies to for the sake of entertainment and work. Our bodies have really degraded with the use of technology.
Yeah,
Carpal tunnel
definitely.
syndrome, neck, spine, back problems, leg problems,
Eyes. Yeah.
obesity, eyes, etc., etc. So definitely, I think that compared to what we've got now in terms of static technology, the next step forward, ideally, is um, sort of. I mean, we should come up with a phrase for it, like moving technology or something like that, or seamlessly
You know
integrated
what?
tech.
Josh called it AR animism.
It's a bit long. Well, let's call it let's call it that for now then. So you've got this AR animism, but then my question would be to go even further than that and say, to what extent is AR animism a solution to a problem that should never have existed in the first place? And to what extent will AR animism create more problems that will then devise more technological solutions? At
Right.
what point do we say the use of technology itself is the problem if we don't make a firm separation between periods where we use technology and periods where we separate from technology, Amish style, Sabbath
Yep.
tech Sabbaths, for instance, maybe like every Saturday, maybe even
Yep.
every weekend, you just don't use tech at all.
Right.
Um, so maybe you'll have AR animism Monday to Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday, you'd have a complete tech teetotal, um, you're just fasting completely off any use of tech. Um, I think that seems to be the ideal balance to me. I like software, by the way. I'm very critical. I've been very critical of it over the past half an hour or so, but I've gained a lot from a few pieces of software like Twitter, for example,
Yep.
or Zoom. So these have been very beneficial. Obviously, they come with their own problems. Um, so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
No, no, no. I don't think that
Yeah,
that's how.
yeah.
I
So
really.
I mean, I think my ideal world would be a sort of tech on the go and then tech fasts, and then you have a balance basically. You make
Yeah.
sure you're in touch with both side of things and trying to maximize the benefit from both without forcing one to submit to the other.
Right. All right. Let's transition kind of to because I think we brought that. I mean, I like those two takeaways. So we'll call it, AR animism during the week and tech Sabbath on the weekend. I love that. You talked about, and I think rightly so, you critiqued, the individualism that boomers really espoused and kind of gave to the world and certainly passed on to their children. Or reared their children with that as a kind of governing worldview. I think I've seen you post something on this, but I'm not sure. But are you familiar with Howe Strauss generational theory?
Yeah, I mean, I read the Wikipedia page and I think I did post a thread on it. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
But they kind of reinvigorate this idea or the use of circular time as opposed to linear time, which often a lot of modernists, for example, or people from or Marx, would use to describe the world, which is basically this idea that in every human life, a long human life, let's say every 80 to 100 years, represents one cycle, and then each stage from childhood to young adulthood to midlife to elderhood represents basically the seasonality of each of those cycles. Each cycle has what's called the fourth turning, which is like the crisis that leads into the new cycle. And the argument, right, for the argument that Strauss and Howe makes is that right now we're in a fourth turning, right? So like the, everything at the beginning of this conversation, Ahmed, that you talked about, the technical debt, and just a whole variety of issues is really right just the destruction of all of the institutions and kind of the ways in which those institutions are not fitted for whatever the next cycle would be. Things like globalization, and supply chains being optimized for efficiency as opposed to redundancy and robustness, or financialization of the economy, and a whole number of different things. I guess I one like what do you think about the concept that we're what do you think of the concept of how Strauss generational theory, kind of at a high level, but you know, what do you think about this concept of a fourth turning? Does it seem, for me, it really seems like it squares with what's occurring right now. Um, and then I would also wonder, like, so right now, the great financial crisis and COVID would be the formative crises of our, kind of young adulthood. And so what does that mean for like the institutions that we would build, right? I mean, I look at things like a focus on, Nassim Taleb's anti-fragility and, digital homesteading and a whole bunch of other charter cities, and that kind of deglobalization as kind of us rejecting what was wrong about the previous cycle, or definancialization, Bitcoin and crypto, against, having experienced the GFC. So, I mean, what do you think about all of that? That was kind of a big tirade, so I apologize, but maybe you can make sense of it.
I mean, it's obviously a very interesting theory, and I buy into it for one main reason, and it's simply because this is just straight up Khaldunian cyclical history theory. So I'm not sure if you've read the book by Ibn Khaldun called The Muqaddimah.
No.
So he was a 14th century Arab historian and sociologist, and his book is essentially, he's considered to be the father of historiography and sociology. So he was the original theorist behind this four cycles theory of rise, apex, decadence, decline. And so essentially what this Strauss-Howe generational theory is, and to be honest with you, what most sociology and most historiography today is, that isn't sort of, Enlightenment Whig linear history. Most cyclical history takes its inspiration from Ibn Khaldun. So this Strauss-Howe generational theory is just straight up Khaldunian cycle. And in that context, I completely agree with it. I think we are sort of in the fourth turning. We are in the sort of decline stage, I guess, where the previous generation has essentially just smashed the commanding heights institutions of society through, rent seeking and individualism, which Ibn Khaldun describes himself. He says this period always comes after the period of Asabiya. So Asabiya is also Ibn Khaldun's idea. I've tweeted about this a lot. And so in the early stages, in the first one or two stages out of these four stages, what you have is a society, and more importantly than society itself, an elite who have this shared ethos, this shared group feeling, this shared vision, and they work together towards this, and they will sacrifice for it even, right? So an example of this is the Roman Empire. Just trying to find this excerpt for the Roman Empire. It's very interesting because it talks about Roman losses to the Carthaginians. Unlike the selfish elites of the later periods, the aristocracy of the early republic did not spare its blood or treasure in the service of the common interest. A third of Rome's casualties in the Battle of Cannae came from the Senate, the Roman elite. So actually, it was the Roman elite who lost more of its members than the Roman foot soldiers and the lower classes. And so this was because there was a strong idea of self-sacrifice and Romanness in the elite, which Khaldun would call Asabiya, right? They had this group feeling. The problem is, over time, this group feeling gets destroyed by later generations who essentially commit to rent-seeking, selling the institutions that the earlier generations built based around their group feeling. They sell these for parts. And what happens is the generation after them, then the generation in decline, which would be our generation today. We see that destruction that, say, the boomers committed. And obviously we then want to go against everything that these people believe in terms of their individualism. We don't want individualism. We want,
Yeah.
we want the tribe again. We want friends. We want families. Okay, we don't want to live for ourselves anymore. We want to have sacrifice for family and community, right? And so this Strauss-Howe generational theory, from what I can read, it received a lot of criticism.
Yes.
And maybe in terms of particulars, attempting to attach specific events in American history, it may not have been the best idea, and a lot of it may not have been too rigorous. But the general idea of 4 stages, I think, as far as any sort of theory created by any thinker, this is as close as we get to an accurate depiction, an accurate science of human history across space-time, whether it's Ibn Khaldun writing about tribal societies in North Africa of the 14th century, to the Roman Empire in, 1st century BC, or even 21st century America. There is
Right.
this general 4 stages that play out. Now, the question then is, how many of these 4 stage cycles can you go through? Because, it doesn't just have to be one. Actually, in a period of decline, what you can have is a renaissance which kickstarts the 4 stages again,
Right.
actually. So the question now is, if we are the generation in decline, what is the philosophy and what are the institutions that we need to create to kickstart that renaissance, and then essentially develop the group feeling and the personal constitution and strength necessary to do the hard work that needs to be done to begin the rise part of the cycle again.
Yeah. I mean, what really well put. And I think, one, at least, I mean, kind of, I view the prerequisite of this. First of all, are you familiar with Peter Turchin?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and one of his big things is that he thinks one of the impediments to kind of any kind of, or something that we would need to get past in order to kind of have this renaissance, is elite overproduction, right? Which I think, which I find interesting because in the context of everything, right, our generation, right, which is also basically going to be tasked with rebuilding those institutions, is subject to this kind of elite overproduction. And what I find interesting is I've set up, there are 4 ways I think you kind of get around this. One is to shrink the elite class, which would be like what you described with the Roman Republic or the Civil War or the French Revolution. But the other is also, to increase the demand for elite labor, which I also wonder is something that you were somewhat teasing at. But there's 2 other things that I could think of. One is to unbundle elite labor from institutions. So, I mean, I think Substack is a good example of that, right? Where you're unbundling, the media elite from those institutions, and maybe it allows for a larger number of them to actually be able to make, to make a living or an impact. But then the 4th point is what I'm really interested in, which is this concept of generating a new elite. And I've talked a lot about, and I'm struggling, but finishing up writing a piece on a new generator function for a new elite, because I think that's obviously what's almost a prerequisite to how you said we need to find the United States needs to spend, for example, the 2020s finding those focused people who understand these things so that they could rebuild those institutions. I guess I suppose I'd wonder, one, what do you think about those kind of 4 solutions: shrinking the elite class, increasing the demand for it, unbundling them, or generating a new superior, elite?
I think right off the bat, what I'll say is American elites today, they aren't elites. They are largely just rent-seeking fail sons living off trust funds for their actual elite parents.
Right.
So this is one of the problems. It's not just elite overproduction. You just have a lot of people who are unqualified,
Right.
called elite, but they're there because of trust funds, etc., etc. Not even just literal trust funds, but in a figurative sense, they've got connections and so on and so forth, which they can get cushiony jobs and so on and so forth. And so I think you never ever want to go in the direction of French Revolution style stripping of the elites.
Right.
If you corner an elite, they're not just going to go into that good night. They will, it's like Samsonian pillars. They will bring everything down with them.
Right.
And really, I think really the only option is a new elite created, grafting the old elites who are still worthy with a new class of elites who would occupy a new premier position. And so the old elites would be sort of secondary.
Right.
But it's necessary because if you don't sort of essentially bribe some of the old elites and give them positions in the new elite, you're going to have a French Revolution style problem.
Right.
So that's the sort of thing that needs to happen.
And
Go ahead.
And I was gonna say, and I think there's an interesting, right? I know that in the in the Roman Empire, there was a practice by which, this could be somebody who could have been a slave of yours, or just somebody who worked on your estate. They would instead of, if they thought that their, heir apparent, who was maybe their son, was not fit to the task, they would, basically change the, and make the person that they would select their successor or their heir apparent that may not be actually related to them. Which, when you talk about pairing an old elite with a new elite, kind of seems somewhat like an interesting historical parallel of an example of that.
Yeah, so I mean, in many ways, this happens in American politics, for instance. If you want to get into the House of Representatives, you are going to want to go in young and attach yourself to an older congressman or woman, and they essentially, quote unquote, adopt you and groom you to replace them when they retire.
Right.
So in a way, that's a sort of similar thing. But I think more than that, it's what you need essentially is a sort of strategy of 1,000 statesmen where over the space of a decade, you have a group of people who are interested in statecraft and governance, essentially forming a parallel to the Federalist Society, but instead of the judiciary, their goal is to see themselves into the heights of government.
Right.
And then they have their own asabiya, they have the group feeling, they have their own vision, and then they sort of coordinate on a tacit level towards turning the imperial machinery towards revival and renewal. So that it's sort of a mission-based, group feeling-based strategy, I guess, that you have to have a conscious group of people doing this. It's not just going to be emergent order. It's got to be people with a vision. And you don't need, you don't need mass movements or anything like that. It literally just, you have highly competent group of people. Maybe there's 1,000 of them, and then they get put to work.
But this is a great wrap-up point anyway, and Ahmed, really, you've been really generous with your time, and really been such a pleasure to chat with you. Why don't you just tell the for the audience, once again, obviously I'll tag you and everything, but where they can read your thinking and follow you.
Yeah, so if you guys are interested in, follow me on Twitter. I write at post_apathy, and I write at www.postapathy.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, Ahmed, thank you so much, everyone. This was Grab the Reins. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.